Patch 9.19, the Worlds patch, is finally here. Now this year for Worlds, Riot is having a little bit different of a focus than they have in previous years. In previous years, Riot would look to nerf picks that were too strong going into Worlds. This year, however, it's a completely different ball game, and their main focus has been looking to buff champions in order to push them into the meta for Worlds. Today we're going to be going over all of these changes and exactly what they mean for each individual champion. If you haven't already, make sure to check out our website GameLeap.com. There we have hundreds of guides, all done by challenger players, sorted into a quick and easy to use courses system. We have courses both on the 5 fundamental roles as well as champion specific courses, so if that is something that interests you, then make sure to check it out using the link in the description below. Now, without further ado, let's get into the most exciting patch of the year. First up is a small buff to Aatrox. Last patch, Riot lowered the damage dealt to minions on Aatrox's Q. They went a little too hard on this nerf, so they are dialing it back a little bit this patch. The Q damage reduction is going to be buffed back up to 55%, which is a happy medium between the two numbers that we've had. This is definitely a buff all around. It helps him manage the wave better and shove faster whenever he wants to. It's not going to change all too much with Aatrox. He's viable now, and he's going to be viable after this buff as well. Next on the list, we have a buff to Akali. Riot is returning some power to Akali after the gutting of her ultimate that they made in patch 9.18. The execute's going to be dealing more damage early on into the game, but the cooldown isn't returning. This is a pretty happy medium where Akali's still able to deal a lot of damage with her ultimate, but she doesn't always have it available. This buff will help especially in some of those tougher matchups for Akali. Now, similar to Aatrox, Akali just was not struggling in the highest echelon of play, so this buff is just going to make her that much stronger in the highest of elos, and a little bit better in the lower elos. Annie is getting a pretty massive buff this patch. They're changing her E from a 1-point wonder to an ability that also scales really well with rank. The movement speed on the ability is going to be more at every single level, and at max rank, the ability is going to be available much more often. This set of changes is really good, especially for support Annie. She's going to be once again viable both as a mid lane pick and a roaming support pick. It's been a while since we've seen support Annie, and I really hope to see it at the Worlds tournament. Ashe is getting some awesome quality of life changes, increasing the effectiveness of her passive early on into the game, and returning the true auto attack reset on her Q. Honestly, the strange partial auto attack reset on Ashe's Q was just weird and very toxic, so it's very good that that's gone, and it's once again a true auto attack reset. Ashe should feel very smooth and satisfying to play again after these changes do end up going through. Blitzcrank is receiving a buff to the range on his Q. On top of this, he's getting an additional charge for his ultimate. This is a really big deal because it increases the already huge zone of control that Blitzcrank has, so as a result, people are going to have to relearn what his new zone of control is. On top of this, Blitzcrank is getting a little bit more damage, so maybe he'll be able to hold his own against the rest of the Hook champions. Now, Fiora is getting an absolutely absurd buff this patch. Her Q is now going to be able to hit towers and wards. On top of this, her E is going to be able to crit towers. This means Fiora is just going to be the ultimate tower melter. Now, we probably won't see her at Worlds because split pushing really is not the meta at the moment. However, in solo queue, Fiora is going to be the ultimate split push pick. This turns Fiora into one of the best picks for all of solo queue because as a top laner, split pushing is one of the only ways that you can control the game. Next is Gragas, who's getting his W cooldown increased and the damage reduction on the ability lowered. This should lower his clear speed and health just by a very small amount. His skirmishing ability isn't going to be lowered all too much, so lane Gragas won't be feeling these nerfs nearly as hard, but he will still feel them. Graves is yet again seeing another buff. He's getting more attack damage early, which is a pretty big issue because Graves already clears pretty well, and he's really strong, especially in the early and mid game. Graves is already a strong pick for solo queue, and these buffs are just going to make him that much stronger. Heimerdinger is getting a set of buffs to his towers, both his normal and ultimate, and his E. All of his towers are getting a 5% increase on ability power, and his E is getting an additional 2.5 seconds on that stun. This allows for a little bit more damage during his combo if he lands the stun. Targets will take a few additional autos from the turrets themselves because of the stun duration, and those towers will be dealing a little bit more damage. As a result, these buffs are fairly big for those Heimerdinger players out there who are able to consistently land their E. This will also allow Heimerdinger's ultimate turret to feel a little bit more powerful. All in all, they're pretty good buffs for those of you who do play Heimer, but I don't think they're big enough to start seeing Heimer as a meta pick. Mid lane Karma is getting nerfed pretty hard this patch. She's losing 20% ability power ratio on her Q. She's not going to be able to easily shove out minions and deal damage as a mid lane pick anymore after this change. This change won't affect her support nearly as much, but it still is a small nerf to support as well. Since her Q is her main source of damage, I don't foresee mid lane Karma being viable after this nerf. Support will probably still be okay, but mid lane Karma is most likely gone. Now moving on, Mordekaiser has an interesting set of changes this patch. The shield value on his W is going to be increasing by 5% based off of the damage that he deals. This is a pretty big deal because Mordekaiser deals so much damage that the shield value that he's going to be getting is going to be noticeable. We will most likely be seeing Mordekaiser at Worlds as a top lane pick, and we will most definitely still be seeing Mordekaiser in solo queue. Again, these changes seem small, but they're actually pretty large. Oriana is getting a massive buff in preparation for Worlds. She's getting an additional 50 flat damage on her ultimate, as well as a 0.1 increase to the AP ratio. This is a massive buff, and we will definitely be seeing Oriana at Worlds because of this. This is very exciting because teams always draft around Oriana, so we might see some pretty sick engage comps this year. This buff will also help out in solo queue, but Oriana really isn't all too popular of a pick below Diamond, so most of you won't have to worry about it. Ornn is going to be unlocking the second portion of his passive early on into the game. Instead of starting to access upgrades at level 13, he's going to be getting them at level 12. This is a pretty big deal for Ornn at the moment because it is a early game focused meta, and he's oftentimes not able to get to max level where he can upgrade everyone's items. Pantheon is receiving some small adjustments that will really only affect him in the bot lane. These are changes that are pretty much only going to be affecting pro play. Pantheon's magic resist is going to be lowered by 4, and the damage on his empowered W is going to be lowered early game but increased late game. This is a nerf to bot lane Pantheon because he gains those levels a lot more slowly, so he's going to be feeling the nerf longer. Pantheon really doesn't get played bot lane in solo queue and only really gets seen in pro play as Pantheon Taliyah bot or some off-meta bot lane pick. I'm not sure if these nerfs are going to be enough to discourage teams from picking Pantheon bot lane during Worlds. He will definitely still be viable as a solo lane both in Worlds and in solo queue, and these nerfs really aren't going to be hurting him in that respect too much. Rek'Sai is getting a little bit more armor, and her unburrowed Q is going to be working on towers. This is a decent buff because it means that Rek'Sai is going to be able to clear a little bit healthier. The tower change, however, is not really going to be felt at all. As a jungler, Rek'Sai is not going to be on the tower all that often, so she won't really be feeling these buffs all too much. Riven is getting a significant buff this patch. Now, to some of you, this may not seem like a pretty huge buff. However, let me assure you, this is huge for Riven mains. Her E is probably her most important ability, so 2 seconds lower on that at all ranks is a massive deal. Riven's E is the ability that she uses in order to cancel all of her other abilities, so when it's up more often, she can animation cancel that much more. Not only that, but it's also her damage mitigation ability and a movement ability. She's going to be taking less damage, she's going to be more mobile, and she's going to be able to deal her damage more smoothly and quickly due to more animation canceling. For the highest level Riven players, this is actually just an insane buff. In fact, this buff might be big enough that we see Riven at Worlds. This is something that just doesn't happen because largely she's considered a one-trick champion. These set of changes might just put her over the edge though. I predict that we will see Riven at least once during this Worlds tournament, hopefully by one of the best teams in the tournament. Sejuani's passive is being gutted this patch. Now her clear won't be felt too hard simply because of the damage cap to monsters, but she will definitely be feeling this in skirmishes. Late game, the damage on her passive is cut in half, which is a pretty huge deal, meaning you're only going to be picking Sejuani for her utility. I still think she will see play in the jungle role during Worlds, and I still think she's a pretty good pick for solo queue, but she's not just going to be the best pick anymore. Syan is receiving a small buff to his W, which will help out his early game. He's going to be able to tank 20 additional damage for every W that he casts, which in the early game is a pretty big deal, but later on into the game is going to be completely unnoticeable. This is a great way to buff Syan because it makes his early laning a little bit better without making his late oppressive. Syan is for sure one of the best tanks to be playing in solo queue since he is always good, he's able to tank, and he's able to deal damage. He fits well into pretty much every single comp. This buff will make it so that Syan is that much better in solo queue, however, it's not going to affect him for Worlds at all. We probably won't be seeing Syan. Now the next change is very complicated and it is to Silas. Right now, Silas is permanently used as a flex pick in all regions. He is a strong pick in top jungle and mid, and this leads to him being a near 100% pick ban ratio. Now, this is very clearly a nerf for jungle Silas. His clear isn't going to be as fast because of it, and on top of that, he's going to be less healthy because of the reduction on his armor. The nerf to mid and top lane is a little bit less obvious on this one. You see, when most people look at this nerf, they'd be focused on how this affects his wave clear. The thing is, that's just not important. You're not picking Silas because of his wave clear, and the change to his wave clear isn't even that big. What's important here is the damage reduction on targets other than the primary target is being reduced against champions. You see, before this patch it was only being reduced against minions, but now it's going to reduce against everything, including champions. This means that if he wants to trade with his passive, he's going to have to get into melee range. Before, you could use the large AoE on Silas's passive in order to trade with the enemy laner without being right next to them. Now that trade is going to do half as much damage as before. The only real compensation here is that late game he's going to have a little bit more wave clear, but again, wave clear wasn't the main thing when it comes to Silas. I think this is a change that most people are going to overlook, and Silas is definitely going to be taken down a tier because of it. Silas's early game threat is going to be a lot harder to pull off now, meaning he should be more niche of a pick. He will definitely still be viable, but he shouldn't be 100% pick ban, so I think these set of changes are actually really good. He should only be picked when you are looking to steal huge ultimates from the enemy team and make plays with those. Something that was in mind when they originally created Silas. These nerfs will be equally felt in solo queue, where again, Silas is going to be taken down a notch. Tahm Kench is receiving some pretty huge nerfs. At the moment, it's pretty hard to poke Tahm Kench out of lane because of his gray health, but the amount of gray health that he's going to be getting early game is cut in half. This is insane, and it means Tahm Kench isn't going to be able to just face tank everything and back off to get all of his health back. The compensation is that late game Tahm Kench is going to be getting more gray health, but honestly this just doesn't make up for the early game nerfs. Now, it's very possible that we still see Tahm Kench support as a bailout pick. However, we shouldn't be seeing teams draft him really early on as a safe pick for bot lane anymore. Moving on, Twisted Fate has some buffs to his E which will affect both AP and ADTF. Now, obviously, this set of changes is going to be more impactful for ADTF, but APTF will still be seeing a little bit of benefit here. Right now it's about a 50-50 split between AD and APTF, and I think this buff will make it so that ADTF is the more prevalent pick between the two. Vayne is getting a buff to the AD received from her ultimate. I'm sure Uzi will love these buffs, and hopefully we get to see the god himself perform on Vayne. Vayne has been struggling a little bit in solo queue, so this buff should help a little bit there as well. Veigar's E is being reduced by 2 seconds at max rank. This is pretty scary because Veigar is already a hyperscaling mid laner. On top of that, this is a buff to his E, the ability that he maxes second, meaning he's going to be receiving that lowered cooldown early into the game. Early and mid game are the only times you're really able to do anything to Veigar, because if you allow him to scale too much, then he's just going to take over the game. Since this is a buff to mid game Veigar, it lowers that amount of time that you have to prevent his scaling. The only reason why I'm not super concerned about these changes is because we are in a heavy early game meta at the moment. This means that Veigar isn't a great pick at the moment, so I don't think we'll be seeing all too much of him. As far as solo queue goes, Veigar is just kind of lackluster because he can't really impact the map. So while these buffs are good for Veigar, he just doesn't really fit the meta for either competitive play or solo queue at the moment. Now moving on to Xin Zhao, he's going to be healing more and dealing more damage. Now these are really small buffs to Xin Zhao, and they're only going to be felt in the early game if at all. Now Xin is already in a pretty good spot as an early game jungler. These buffs probably won't affect him all too much, but we may see a small increase in popularity for solo queue. Yuumi is receiving a pretty big nerf this patch. Her Q is going to be slowing for a lot less as we go further on into the game and for a shorter duration. This is a pretty big deal because before this nerf, Yuumi was really good at chasing down targets, but afterwards she's just not going to be able to. Now the final change this patch will be to Zac. Zac's ultimate is receiving a small buff. For each point in his ultimate, his passive is going to be healing him an additional 1%. This will help Zac a lot as we go later on into games. The more blobs he's able to pick up, the more he's going to be able to heal, which means he'll be able to live longer, cast more abilities, and therefore pick up even more blobs. Right now, Zac is a pretty bad champion, so seeing this change go through is awesome because it means that we might be able to see Zac in solo queue, which we haven't for a long time. That just about does it for today's Worlds patch. For those of you who haven't already, make sure to check out our website, GameLeap.com. There we have hundreds of guides, all done by challenger players, sorted into a quick and easy to use courses system. We have courses both on the 5 fundamental roles as well as champion specific courses, so if that is something that interests you, make sure to check us out using the link in the description below. I've checked out a lot of the content on there myself, and I can honestly say it is all really high quality. If you are wanting to improve your League of Legends gameplay, then our website is one of the best learning tools out there, so if you haven't already, make sure to check it out. As always, I'm Panther, I hope you learned something valuable, and I will see you in the next one.